Well, thanks very much. Thanks very much. I'm really happy to be here tonight, and I'm looking forward to sharing a few open-ended kinds of remarks and comments about infrastructure, interested in your feedback on it, and also interested in hearing other questions that you may have or input you may have towards the end of our session. So when I put this material together, I first wanted to think about what are the basic components here. I want to make sure we talk a little bit about what infrastructure is and is not. I want to talk briefly about the legislation that was passed in the United States last fall and as it pertains to infrastructure, and then back up and think a little bit more about how policymakers and economists in particular might think about answering the question why we need it, how much do we need, and what impact does it have if it's low quality versus high quality? Where do we sit in that regard? And of course, as an economist, always want to know how we should pay for something. So we'll spend a little time thinking about that as well. And then tying it up, thinking about moving forward, what the key challenges are in this realm. So let's go ahead and start with the first question, which is, what do we mean by infrastructure? And so I've got a couple of little polls here set up that my colleagues are going to help me run here. So you're going to have a poll with 4 questions. How should we, this should be there. Very good. What is infrastructure? So please indicate your agreement with this statement. Roads and bridges are basic infrastructure. So why don't you go ahead and tell me what you think your response is there. So we have 2 brave people so far who have weighed in. I know there are more of you there. So go ahead and tell me what you think there. So I'm looking off at the side because I'm watching the horizontal bars tell me the progress of your answers, how many people are answering and what their answers are. So we'll give it just another 10 seconds or so.
All right, I'll go ahead and end the poll.
Now, and that's just the first question, so we can come back. Yeah, great.
Yes, I'll leave all 4 questions up.
Perfect. Okay, so are you showing, do people see the answers now? Is that something that everyone sees, or
Let's
just
see.
me?
I can share them in 1 second. Let's see. Here we go. I think everyone can see them now.
Can folks see the answers that you all gave? Okay, sweet. So this one, this was sort of like the no-brainer type question, right? Roads, bridges, stuff like that. Definitely long-lived assets. They deliver a lot of value to people. They're collectively produced and collectively consumed in a way. And you can see that 3/4 of you strongly agreed with the claim that roads and bridges are basic infrastructure, and most of the rest of you agreed with that statement. So not a lot of drama there. How about that second question now for school buildings? Are school buildings basic infrastructure? That's our second question. I'm having a little trouble controlling the display of that for me. So if someone could tell me, I'm having a little trouble.
That's okay. I can tell you, Paula, for the second question, what was answered. This one was, everyone was not as in agreement on the first one. This was a little bit more split. So for the second question, we had 50% strongly agreed, 45% agreed, 3% were neutral, and 2% disagreed on whether schools are basic infrastructure.
Sweet. Okay, thank you. Very good. So just real quick, anyone who either was neutral or who disagreed with the claim that school buildings and school facilities are basic infrastructure? Anyone want to offer a rationale or why they chose that answer? What makes school buildings different from roads and bridges?
Oh, Ken, I saw Ken had his hand up.
Ken.
I'm wondering, testing, can you hear me?
Mhm.
I'm wondering, I was actually have to wonder, kind of if basic is synonymous with physical. And then from there, I just thought, okay, I feel like if it is, then I'd say strongly agree, but because I'm not sure, I'm just gonna put agree. That was my thought
All
process.
right. Okay. A lot of people would make a distinction between school buildings and roads and bridges. They might say both are needed by a modern society, and governments do need to plan for and pay for somehow the building of those things and making them available. But they're going to make a distinction where roads and bridges are clearly something that affects people's ability to get around, commerce to happen, adding to productivity in a very apparent way, whereas school buildings are but one ingredient in an educational sector, which again, we hope builds productivity, develops human capital, things like that, but not quite the same. All right, so how about another one? I think our third question is basically the question about the same question as it pertains to broadband facilities.
This one was interesting and how timely, as we're all using more broadband probably than ever. This one, we had 47% strongly agreed, 42% agreed, 11% were neutral, but no one disagreed or strongly disagreed about broadband.
Great, terrific. So again, we're looking at facilities, physical things that add to our ability to produce goods and services, add to our ability to become educated, to conduct other kinds of investments, things of that sort. And so, we definitely, as a general matter, want to think about this this type of facility as infrastructure that governments need to think about how it's going to be provided and paid for. Okay, one more. Long-term care services.
This one was interesting. We had some disagreement on this. So for long-term care is basic infrastructure, only 18% strongly agreed, 53% agreed, 23% were neutral, and 6% disagreed.
Okay, that's perfect. That's because all the people on this Zoom call could have served in US Congress last year when deliberations were underway on the President Biden's proposed infrastructure investment legislation. All right, I'm going to show you more about that in a moment. But essentially, a lot of people said long-term care, society does need to think about how to provide it. We have individuals who need those services, but that's not the same conversation that we would have when we're thinking about roads or transit facilities or power plants or broadband facilities. Okay, so I think you're getting the point here that we want to be intentional about how we're thinking about infrastructure. Okay. Having a little trouble getting the mouse back where I need it. Okay, I think I got it now. Okay, so infrastructure, what is it? Many times people will distinguish between basic, social, and digital. Basic would be roads, bridges, power facilities, water facilities, drinking water, stormwater facilities, waste management facilities, solid waste, things like that. All right, basic. Then they talk about social infrastructure, school buildings, government courthouses, school, city hall. You know, yes, those are physical long-lived assets, but they don't directly add to productivity in the private sector in the same way that other assets do. And then sometimes people will make a distinction and talk about digital infrastructure like broadband kind of stuff. Now, in the legislation that was proposed initially, then deliberated and discussed to death, and then finally revised and passed, very interesting, in the original proposal, I mean, it was huge. It was $2.3 trillion in its original form. Eventually that legislation was introduced into the House and passed by the House, went to the Senate, went back and forth. And finally, when it came back to actually be passed, it was much, much lower, just over $1 trillion. So let's just look at a couple of pictures that I think highlight exactly what you were kind of alluding to in your responses to my questions. This graphic shows us what was in the original proposal. So again, it was like $2.3 trillion. And here's the stuff I would say was mainly basic infrastructure: roads, bridges, railways, electric vehicles, ports and waterways, transit. All right, so that's stuff for sure. And then here's the stuff, the next piece, like power and digital broadband stuff, broadband, power infrastructure, resiliency, things of that sort. What ended up really dropping off the wayside were these other big slices. Housing, schools, and buildings dropped completely. It's not that they're not important, but they weren't going to go through on the basic infrastructure bill. Home and community-based care completely axed. That's a problem we still have, but this bill isn't the one to solve it. And then R&D and manufacturing incentives of one kind or another also dropped out. And so here's what it looked like once they took it away. Okay, a lot smaller of a less ambitious piece of legislation. So why do we need infrastructure? The key idea here is that infrastructure are these long-lived, publicly owned assets, in general, publicly owned, that improve not only productivity, but quality of life for people in their communities. They help us get around. They help us make sure we're going to be able to have safe drinking water. It means we have reliable energy when we need it. And as Jenny was alluding to a few minutes ago, we have just come through and continue to go through a world where our demands for broadband access and digital platforms, one kind or another, it's huge, right? And we also know that in some parts of our communities throughout the country, people don't have reliable access to broadband or digital assets. So, you know, we really need to think about how all of those things help build quality of life for people in our communities. So I'm going to focus on these kinds of goods and assets. I'm going to exclude interesting questions, but I'm going to push them off to the side about education and health facilities and things like that. So why do we think about the public sector here? Why don't I just think, well, there's some nice old company that's going to come up, a private sector firm that's going to build out the infrastructure we need? And I think the main reason we don't end up there is related to externalities or spillovers. Many of these assets create value for the people who live in the jurisdictions, but also create value for people outside the jurisdictions. So there is some collective benefit being provided by these assets, and left on our own, if I'm just thinking about myself in my own little town, I might not be aware of all of those other benefits, and therefore I might underinvest. And so we really need to sort of keep that issue in mind when we think about who's going to do all of this. So let's talk a little bit about quantity and quality. So the first question, how much stuff, how many units, tons, dollars, square feet, whatever, how much should we have? Well, essentially you want enough stuff so that the marginal benefit of another unit of infrastructure equals the marginal cost of producing one more unit of that infrastructure. So for those of you who end up, coming to Harris, maybe some of you have had some economics before, we're thinking at the margin. That's always a really key idea. We need to think about the fact that these assets last a long time. And so we don't just want to think about what benefits they give us today. We want to think about it benefits over a long period of time. And obviously, this is something that varies a lot by sector and by geography. So here's a picture that is intended to sort of give you a basic picture of what it's been like in the United States over a long period of time. So this is since 1947. This is since World War II. So what do you see? You see that total infrastructure investment has risen somewhat gently over a long period of time, and that's in real terms, so that's good. But what you don't see from that top number is the difference in these sectors. So what the three different sectors tell you is, here's digital from nothing up to a lot, right? Digital has just, exploded over our lifetimes. Social infrastructure too has risen pretty significantly over time, whereas basic infrastructure has been gently rising, but kind of flat. And so the essence of what you're going to read about in the paper is our roads are in bad shape, our bridges are in bad shape, our buses are old, our water treatment plants need rehabbing and refurbishment. Those ideas are reflected in this picture for the basic infrastructure spending not rising that much. This is just another graph to sort of make the point about what digital looks like. In 1957, the digital slice of infrastructure spending was tiny. By 2017, it's over 30%. All right. So, digital is really driving the bus, if you will. So that gives you a little bit of a flavor of how much. It's not, there's other things I could say, but let's leave it at that. What about how good it is? Is it like in good quality? Is it good condition? So the American Society of Civil Engineers will be the first to tell you we're terrible. They give us a report card every few years. Usually we get a D. In 2021, our grade went up from a D to a C+. So there was improvement there, okay? And then when you look at the overall sort of sector by sector breakdown and how much it's going to cost to get it to a state of good repair, you're looking at $5.9 trillion. So keep that number in mind. Remember what the Biden plan was, 2.3 trillion, but a lot of that was not for basic infrastructure. It was for long-term care or schools and buildings and things like that. And there's less of that in here than in the Biden initial proposal. So why does the Society of Civil Engineers give us such a terrible grade? A lot of reasons. I'm going to show you a few pictures. Maybe you can bring your own stories to the conversation as well. Here are some sample indicators of the stress and quality degradation we have experienced here in the United States. We have traffic congestion. We have degraded measures of pavement quality. That means your hubcaps fall off. It means your suspension systems get damaged in your cars. Bridge conditions, not so good. Transit assets in poor shape, ages of buses and the rolling stock. Aviation, we have congestion and traffic control system upgrades that we haven't done. Water utilities, we worry about quality of our drinking water. We have lead service pipes in a lot of communities in the United States. In smaller rural communities, we have other contaminants reaching our water supplies. What are we going to do about that? What about stormwater? We don't manage that very well either. Power sector, we worry. I mean, in general, I think the US has really been amazing in terms of putting together a sector that provides reliable energy to people on demand, both individuals and businesses. But we've seen a lot of things in Texas and California over the last couple of years that showed some fragility in that system. And then we talked a little bit about broadband. So those are just some examples. Here are a few pictures. Urban road congestion. This is a picture I love to show, bad cost for average commuters. And then you have COVID, okay? Because 2020, people shut down, we shut down and people stayed home more. So that's not due to some sort of transportation policy. It's due to COVID-related shutdowns. Delays on inland waterways. It's not a big deal, but here in the Midwest, we have Chicago River, which ultimately feeds into the Mississippi River. And we are part of an elaborate network of inland waterways, which firms use to ship low value items, grains and heavy things as well. And those facilities are degraded. The locks are old, the dams aren't always in good shape. And that means there are delays. They have to, things break, they have to take time to fix it, and shippers are delayed. So that's another measure of degradation of quality. This is a picture showing, you don't have to look at the details. This is the average age of infrastructure assets. And what you can see is that it's rising over time. Our infrastructure is getting older. This is another representation of age. Millions of lead service lines in our water utilities. We know that there's no amount of lead in the blood that is deemed to be a safe level of lead exposure. And one of the biggest contributors to presence of lead in blood, especially of children, is the presence of lead in their water supply. So even though I want you all to apply to Harris and come here, I have to admit, here's Illinois, and we have the nation's largest number of lead service lines still to replace in the country. So not really something to be proud of. This table is really about broadband, and there aren't really great numbers on this for reasons I could go into at another time. What I would just highlight here is that by 2014, almost 90% of Americans, had some decent access to broadband. And 5 years later, that had crept up even further. And so that's not a bad place to be. But what that misses, I think, is the big discrepancy between urban and rural areas. And in rural areas, in 2014, only 60% of people had reliable access. By 2019, it's at 83%. Maybe it's improved a little bit, but we all know that the COVID disruptions, remote learning requirements, and the like, actually both in rural and urban environments, really taxed us, really were difficult to bear. And actually what's kind of interesting, I'd have to go back and look at that particular report. But if you look at the title, it says percentage of Americans with access to. I'm not sure that means they've bought it, right? It means that the service is offered, not that they purchased it. And so that's something that we saw a lot of problems with, right, with COVID, right? So we have a lot of parts of our infrastructure world that suggest, gosh, we have some improvements to undertake. So now what I'd like to do is pivot a little bit and talk about like, okay, maybe we don't have enough. Maybe some of what we have is old and degraded and we need to make it better. So how do we pay for it? How do we do that? And my main point here really is that you only have two options. You either are going to use tax revenue or you're going to use some kind of revenues coming from your users, tolls, fees that they've paid, charges of one kind or another. And so now if I could have the next poll teed up, I'll ask your opinion and point of view for different kinds of assets and infrastructure, how much we should rely on taxes versus how much we should rely on these fees and charges. So the first one is, how should we pay for roads and bridges? Mostly taxes, mix of taxes and user charges, or mostly user charges? And then same thing for schools and then for broadband.
It's so interesting to watch the results come in and the poll bars shift back and forth.
Yeah, I can see a little bit of it, but not the full set of results.
Okay, I still see a few answers coming in. So
Okay.
Give everybody about 15 more seconds to answer all three questions, and then I
Great.
can read off the results for anyone who's having an issue seeing. So
Great.
all right, the bars stopped moving.
Okay, good.
Oh.
Good.
Okay, let me go ahead and share all of this. All right, I think, all right, so for our first question, how should we pay for roads and bridges? 46% said mostly taxes, 52% a mix of taxes and user charges, and 1% mostly user charges.
Terrific. So who wants to tell me, like, what kind of user charges are we really thinking about for roads and bridges? What's a good example of a user charge for a road or a bridge?
Oh, I saw a hand raise. I will probably mispronounce your name. I apologize, but I see Shiomara has a hand raise. Oh, I'm getting some direct messages on this one too, Paula. Brittany,
Okay.
Matthew, Jamie all said toll.
Okay, tolls, good. Yeah, tolls, right? Like I just was on the Indiana toll road and I had to pay tolls to use it. I used the Chicago Skyway, a big bridge, and I had to pay a toll to use it. So that's a good example. Any others for the roads and bridges?
Riley, I saw your hand pop up. I think you can unmute. Ooh. Let's see. There we go.
I was going to say tolls as well.
Oh, okay, good. So it's a little bit of a sleight of hand, but also a lot of people here said taxes and user charges. What's an example of a kind of tax that is relevant in the road and bridge space? What kind of taxes do we use?
Timothy sent in a direct message mentioning specifically the gas excise tax.
Absolutely. So most states levy an excise tax on gasoline purchases, and many states also levy an ad valorem sales tax on top of that, so that when you're buying your gasoline at the pump, you're paying those two taxes, one or both of those two taxes. So that's a kind of tax that is a specific tax. Almost, it's aching to be a user fee, because the more I drive on the roads, the more I'm going to have to fill my car up with gas and the more taxes I'm going to end up paying. right?
We have
So, yeah,
another comment came in from Gillian or Jillian, and I just paid for the license plate stickers on my car in the state of Illinois. So top of mind for me, but she mentioned the automobile ownership taxes.
yes. So a couple of ideas there. We absolutely do use recurring license fees to help pay for some of our roads and transportation surface infrastructure expenditures. So that would be like your license fee, your driver's license fee, things like that. Ownership tax there are a couple of ways to think about that. One is taxing a transaction where a car is sold. And basically we think of that as a sales tax for the most part. May have some special components perhaps, but still it's taxing a transaction. But to actually just be taxed on the fact that you own a car, most states don't do that anymore. Some they used to, but maybe they should. That's a good question. So now think about the school construction, and I see enough on my screen here that suggests it looks like 70% of people said mostly taxes, 27% said a mix, and then maybe a smidge said user charges. So what's interesting about schools versus roads is that by law, culture, and custom, we do not charge people to send children to the public schools. So we do not have a steady base of user charges. And that's a feature of the US system. Now, it is the case that there are a lot of schools that will say, of course, it's free to send your kid to school here because you live here. But if your kid wants to be in marching band or play on the basketball team, you're going to have to pay an extra fee. Or, like there's a little, and there's been growth in that kind of choice by local schools, but still the total number of dollars you're talking about is very, very low. In this country, we rely on general tax revenues to pay for schools overall and school buildings in particular. Typically, a local school will simply use a property tax and then take some of those dollars to pay for the school building. And then the last item was, what was it? Broadband. So that one I can't see. Oh, wait, maybe I can. Let's see. Okay. Yeah, so this one looks even yet more different, right? Where there were a significant number of you who said, actually, it should be mostly user fees, right? Because why? Because you're getting a material private benefit by having that broadband access in your house or in your business to support your operations. So let's see if I can successfully get my mouse back to where I need it. Okay, great. Okay, so is there a general principle we could extract from this conversation? I think the short answer is yes. When you have an asset that provides benefits broadly, widely to many people, then using general tax revenues can be a very sensible way to pay for the project or the asset. Because the benefits are accruing to everybody who lives in a jurisdiction, not just those who live next door to it. On the other hand, we want to sort of rely more heavily on user charges or user fees when the benefits from consuming really are largely experienced by the individual who's doing the consuming. So that's the driver on a roadway, or the individual who turns the switch on in his house and now has electricity. The fact that I have electricity in my home providing me comfort and utility and what have you, it doesn't provide any spillover benefits to you. And so there's a sense in which, well, then I should be paying for it. I'm going to have more to say about affordability in a moment. Were there more questions coming through on the chat that I need to address right now? Or are we okay?
We didn't have any other specific questions that
Okay.
have come through. Yeah.
Okay, sweet. So why am I talking about taxes and user fees? Why don't I just say, oh, for heaven's sakes, borrow the money to build these things? And the reason we don't say that is because if you borrow the money, you have to pay it back. And then that just begs the question, well, where are you going to get the funds to pay it back? And the answer will, again, lead you to one or both of these places, using some tax revenues or using user charges. So, that's a general kind of point. In the real world, of course, it's pretty darn complicated. This is a picture showing our transportation system here in Northern Illinois. And what this is kind of emphasizing is that for different types of transportation, transit, state roadways, local roadways, and tollways, we have different funding sources. So for the tollways, which are restricted access, you can only get on if you're going to pay and then use the facility, we use toll revenues. But everything else uses a mix, a really hot mess of fare box revenues, sales taxes, general revenues, fuel taxes, as one of the participants here tonight pointed out. We have gasoline taxes. So anyway, it's in the real world, we rely on mixtures. And I guess I'll just leave it at that. So let's just say now, talk a little bit more about these user fees, how important they are in the US, whether they're too low, too high, or just right, whether they're fair, and what complications we face when we think about them. So point one, they're big. We use them a lot in the United States, okay? So states and local governments rely on these for a lot. Now, that's not just infrastructure spending that's being funded by these things, but still my point is we're not shy about charging people to use government provided services. What happens if user fees are set too low? Well, people will want more units than can be provided. Okay, so that's a way why we have traffic congestion, right, on our major highways in our urban areas at rush hour, because too many cars want to be on there at the same time. So that's what happens when your user fees are set too low. What happens if your user fees are set too high? Well, then you end up with excess supply, all right, and wasted resources, and then you're not going to raise enough revenue to cover your costs. So that's a problem too. When user fees are just right, you're balancing at the margin the value to users with the value of providing the service, and that's kind of the sweet spot. That's what we aim for. Don't always get there. So big question. Can't believe no one's called me out on it yet. Is this fair? Is this fair to charge people for access to these big assets, to roads, bridges, water treatment plants, things like that? Well, there is an insight from the public finance literature that we call the benefits principle. And what that is about is understanding that for some of these services, the individual consumer really gets some value, personal value from consuming it. It's easy to see that in some cases, like recreational services. Like I live near a golf course, a municipal golf course. If I go to play golf there, the only person who gets any value out of that is me. And so it's not a crazy thing to think, that I should have to pay the price to do that. So that's not necessarily a bad idea. It's harder when you're talking about access to clean water or access to some minimum level of digital broadband service. And that brings me to the complications. We know we have spillover effects, so we don't want to charge people so much that they don't actually buy the service. But the real complication I want to highlight here is affordability. What if these user charges, which are deemed necessary to pay for these infrastructure improvements, what if those user charges are too high? Cities and states around the country, this country, and in other countries too, are struggling with this. Water is a great example of that. It costs real resources to provide clean drinking water, to distribute it, to make it available to people in a reliable fashion. What if the money it takes to do that presents too great a cost burden to low-income individuals, households, or families? What are you going to do about that? So, one response is to say, well, I'm not going to rely on user charges. I'm going to maybe charge a little and throw a lot of tax money at it. So that would be something we could do. In the US context, what some cities have started to do in water anyway, is be more creative in customizing sort of a system with some price discrimination in it, basically, where if you meet certain income guidelines, you are charged a lower unit price than individuals who don't meet those guidelines. And so there's a little bit of customization of the price. In the end, the money has to come from somewhere, but you're also being attentive to the differences in capacity among your ratepayers, and that's, I think, really important. So just because I'm pushing user fees doesn't mean I'm an ogre. So just keep that in mind. So last few slides before I open it up here to some questions. When I think about what lies ahead here in the US and the world overall, I have a couple of challenges in my mind. Challenge number one is climate change. How do we increase sustainability and resilience in a world of such sort of changing natural forces, right? We have stranded assets everywhere. We have coal-fueled power plants. We have assets that are in the wrong places. Every little town that put in a water treatment plant, you know where they put it? They put it at the lowest point in their community, right? Because then gravity brought the water there for them to deal with. Well, that's really good in a lot of ways, but it's really bad if you're starting to worry about increased frequency and severity of flooding. So we have assets that are literally in the wrong places. How bad is this? Everyone has their preferred graph or way of talking about this. I'll just show you one. This is a series put together by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. And they basically keep track of big natural disasters and climate change. And what you can see is that the total value of the losses associated with flooding, tornadoes, hurricanes, things like that, going up over time. So it's a problem. Challenge two, social equity. If nothing else, the last 2 to 5 years have highlighted ongoing, deep, and pervasive disparities in access to all kinds of sort of positive amenities and experiences, but also exposure to negative ones, right? We have infrastructure assets that are in places like power plants, things like that, transmission facilities, solid waste disposal facilities. Where are those located? In close proximity to low-income communities, often. Sometimes high minority communities as well. So what are we going to do about that? How do we want to modify conventional analysis to take into consideration that there are these legacy impacts of infrastructure investment decisions made a long time ago. So what is this? This is just, again, one random kind of example from a particular study of exposure to certain kinds of particulates in the air. And by looking at the racial composition of the census tracts, the authors were able to sort of identify that Black majority census tracts on average were experiencing far greater exposure to these damaging particulates than were census tracts primarily that were majority Hispanic or white. And so we have, you know, like I say, that's just one kind of example to show you, but it's a real problem that we face. And then finally, I would say we face this sort of double whammy of technological change and globalization. You know, we need to adjust our regulatory processes to be forward-looking and ambitious. We want Tesla and other, you know, innovative companies to do exciting things, make those leaps, follow those investment paths. At the same time, we want to protect the health and welfare of people right now. And we don't even know in a post-COVID world what we really want. We don't know how many people are going to want to live near a city, in a city, far away from a city. Where are they going to work relative to where they're going to live? A lot of unanswered questions for us today. And then, you know, this is just one way of showing that our regulatory structure is buckling under the strain of rapid innovation, but stagnant, inflexible sort of regulatory processes. So this is just showing you how long it takes to approve a pipeline in the United States. Over, you know, a 10-year period of time, you see that the number of days needed goes up and up and up. That's just like one little picture. So to recap, I would just say that, you know, these infrastructure assets, they aren't necessarily that sexy. I mean, who really wants to talk about roads and bridges? It doesn't seem that interesting. But the fact is that these assets enable and enhance the quality of our lives. They make businesses more productive. They make us more productive. We get more enjoyment out of things, but it's expensive. And we need to think hard about what we want to do and how to pay for it in the fairest possible way. And that is what I have.
Professor, we have, as always, a lot of questions coming in now. So I'll go ahead and start with a few, some really specific and some ones that I think are some hot topics. So a question that Jillian mentioned, she said, Professor, you talked about potential solutions for ability to pay, such as differential pricing to solve for fairness. From your perspective, is equity and class mobility something that should be solved for in terms of benefiting society as a whole? One person wins by getting better access and self-actualizing, then we all win. I'm specifically thinking about services such as broadband that may be foregone by low-income households, even if they are priced low, but are critical for COVID-age virtual schooling, which thereby impacts future American education and productivity.
Well, I think the broadband example is really telling here, because those infrastructure investments offer the opportunity to improve quality of life, enhance human capital formation across the board over a long period of time. And for some families and communities with limited means, they may not be able to acquire those resources at the level really needed to be successful for the individual students then to be successful, be it in grade school, high school, or college, right? And that is, we are really just hurting ourselves in the long run by not providing the resources needed for those individuals and families to tap in that way. And I think the Infrastructure Investment Act passed last November, you know, provides some real money to enhance broadband service and make it more affordable. I do not know particular details of those initiatives, and some of it was written out in a lot of detail in the legislation, and some of it was like, here's $1 billion. I direct the Secretary of Transportation to figure out how to spend it on a certain thing. And that was all it said. So I'm not sure what detail is available on that. But I think, you know, we have to acknowledge that some of these access to the services provided by these assets are essentials to people in today's world.
Professor, another question that has come in from Riley. Many of us were talking about this today, especially colleagues at Harris who have students in CPS. But this question was, were there any observable changes in how the city of Chicago spent on infrastructure during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Ooh, I can't say I know much more than anyone who reads the paper might know. I do believe that city of Chicago, and I know some other cities too, you know, spent a fair amount of money to put laptops in the hands of maybe not all students, but most, you know, above a certain grade level. Unfortunately, you know, sometimes those laptops did not come with any significant amount of training or tech support. So in some instances, here's these machines, they come into these homes, no one knows how to use it. And the access to the, you know, the digital component, the online component is not solid, or if it's available at all. So I'm sure the schools feel like they spent a lot of money. Did they spend it wisely? I don't know.
Another question from Michael. To what extent are the changes we need to improve infrastructure and prepare for the challenges of climate change feasible without a significant federal government investment or spending? Yeah,
it's a good question. I don't think they are feasible without a significant federal commitment. I kind of glossed over this early, but you know, the Infrastructure Investment Act that was passed in the fall, I think it was $1.1 trillion, but really only about 600 billion or so, I think, was what we might call new money. The rest was money that was already going to go out the door, which goes out the door normally to help pay for roads, bridges, water infrastructure, transit, things of that sort. So, you know, only half of it, say, was new money. Still 1.1 trillion. That's a lot of federal money. But one thing that is, I didn't show you any pictures on this, but states and local governments also spend a lot of money on infrastructure. So it has to be viewed as a bit of a partnership. Federal, state, and local governments. And in the broadband, digital, telecoms, and power industries, private sector. They're the ones who own all those assets. They're the ones who are doing the investments. So it's not just a public sector responsibility in that realm.
Two questions that we have came in that are a little bit similar from Shamara and Ken. So Shamara had asked, do we know what % of infrastructure is used by people versus companies, and who pays the most in taxes? And Ken asked, what would be required in a future where basic infrastructure is free, thinking about kind of the individual, if more of these companies are paying?
Well, I think the answer to the question about individual consumer end user, consumption versus business probably varies a lot by sector and the type of asset you're talking about. So, for example, you could absolutely look at the US Department of Transportation and highway statistics and say something about, vehicle miles traveled, how much of that is individual cars versus heavy trucks, for example. And so no one's driving a heavy truck just for themselves. They're driving it for a commercial purpose. So you could start with something like that. And you could say something, there's a lot of evidence, heavy trucks do most of the damage on our roadways, so on and so on. But that's not going to be the case for all of the assets. Now, in terms of the pricing, it's an interesting question. I believe it is the state of Kansas that has a pricing structure for trucks that tries to essentially say, you know what, you guys, when you drive your trucks through my state, you're big, you're heavy, you're causing a lot of damage to my roadways. I'm going to charge you for that. Consumers don't have to do that. Individual folks don't have to do that. So, there's some precedent for that kind of discrimination, price discrimination.
All right, I'm doing a quick scroll to see if there were any other questions that we missed, and I'm not seeing everything. I think we got to all of them. So, Professor, any final information you have to share with students or anything for them to keep in mind, as they're thinking about graduate school or thinking about, where they want to study, what they want to do?
Just encourage you to, ask as many questions of staff, faculty, current students, alums, as is feasible. Policy school isn't for everyone, but it is for a lot of you. The fact that you're on this call tonight suggests you have some interest in the kinds of things we think about here at the Harris School, and we try to prepare our students to go on to work in private sector, public sector, or nonprofit sector settings, to make a difference. And I look forward to seeing some of you, many of you, next year at Harris.
All right, well, thank you, Professor. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. And everyone have a good evening. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks for inviting me. Bye.